Let's get underway. Really excited about tonight's session and the opportunity to explore what I'm at this stage calling the fans. I think there's potential opportunity that as an industry we are missing something by not engaging with the fans of the participants, and want to explore that in some detail. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Chris Robb. I'm the CEO and founder of Mass Participation World. Delighted to be hosting again tonight and to be joined by an amazing panel that brings a huge amount of diversity of knowledge and experience to the conversation. And I think to put on the table right up front, we were chatting on our planning call. We don't pretend to have the answers at this stage. This is something that we're, I think, wrestling with, not just in mass participation, but in sport generally. As you know, how do we better engage the fans? What are the opportunities? And from a mass participation perspective, I think it's a thought process that's fairly new to many. So hopefully we can stimulate some conversation. Love to have some engagement. Throw your questions into the chat. And I'll monitor those and try and weave them into the conversation. But let's start by welcoming our guest tonight, Stephanie Green, Partner Solutions Manager of Meta, joining us from London. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Great to see you. Tim Godfrey, who's the Chief Marketing Officer of the Professional Triathletes Organization, also joining us from London, just off a plane from Doha yesterday. So he may nod off partway through, but he assures me he's had enough caffeine to keep him going. Great to see you, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks. And a very old friend of Mass Participation World, Anmish Paratharathi, the founder and executive director of Pictureboard Partners, joining us from Singapore.
Good evening, despite the background, everybody from Singapore. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, you've managed to keep the daylight there in Singapore, even at 8 o'clock at night. Wonderful. And apologies, in this COVID world, we were due to be joined by Caroline Darcy, the former global head of sponsorship for Standard Chartered Bank. Unfortunately, she is pretty poorly with COVID. We send her our very best wishes, and obviously would have loved to have had her insights on the conversation. Some quick housekeeping before we get underway. As always on a webinar, the best way to communicate is in the chat and in the Q&A. We've allocated 60 minutes and very keen to stick to that time. If we have a raft of questions, we may stay on a couple of minutes longer, but really would like to get finished on time. We are live streaming on Facebook. We are recording. The recording will be posted on the MPW YouTube channel and on MPW Academy within a few days. Delighted, as we have been for, I think it's about 6 months now, to be live streaming into China. A big thanks to Julia Tui, Jerry, and Huao out of Beijing for CGX Consulting. Wonderful to have them supporting us again. A couple of quick initiatives, MPW Global Updates. We had the latest edition on Tuesday this week. That's just a quick roundup that I do, live stream on Facebook and LinkedIn for 15-20 minutes, and then we turn it into a podcast. That podcast just went live today, the second and fourth Tuesdays of every month, just a global roundup and a bit of a theme. We spoke about permits on Tuesday, permits and approvals. The next MPW web series will be on the 26th of May, and another one to try and provoke a little bit of thought and maybe a different perspective. It's called Moving the Start Line, Technology and Digital First, Then Physical. And looking forward to having some conversations around that. As always, happy to support wherever I can, Chris at massparticipationworld.com, or join with me on the various platforms, and of course our Road Ahead newsletter, which goes out every week. I'm just going to pop a quick poll in here to get a sense of who's on the call. Before I give a bit of an overview of the key areas that we're going to talk about today. We want to talk about the fans to start with. We want to define what a fan is from a mass participation perspective, what their needs might be, and stimulate some conversation around that. We're then going to talk about engagement and a number of different areas around engagement, how we might be able to engage with those fans once we've defined them. The role of technology and data. the big and really important one in an industry that is really struggling with its current commercial model. How can we commercialize this? How might we be able to drive revenue streams and maybe save some marketing costs in terms of building pipelines? And then we'll touch on challenges and obstacles, and they might not necessarily come in those orders, but that's the key kind of buckets, if you will, that we're going to talk about. I'll throw a few polls into the conversation as we're going along, and put the results of them up, but I won't interrupt the conversation for that. So why don't we get underway with having a conversation around defining a fan. And Tim, you've got the pros that you look after, but you've also got the age groupers and the recreational triathletes. What would you say your kind of definition of a fan would be at this stage, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So the PTO Tour launches this year, and it's going to be the first time that the PTO has had, age group racing and a kind of mass participation element to our race. And so we've now got a huge task ahead of us to try and establish, what is the experience for the pro, the fan, and the participant. So I guess we're going through that process at the moment. But fundamentally, we want to have quality over quantity. So I think we're really going to hone in on kind of a few very defined experiences on site for the participant and for the fan, rather than, we have the beauty of only having, when we're up to full spec, kind of 6 events a year. So that by definition means that we don't have to worry about too much scale and, kind of being spread too thinly. We can kind of hone in on certain elements for the fan. But I would also say that, I think the mass participation world has kind of pigeonholed fans and participants and pros into separate buckets. And I guess, one of our aims of the PTO Tour is to look at it far more holistically and to connect the dots. So we want to make sure, when we come away from our events, that the fans are connecting with the pros are connecting with the fans, and fundamentally we create that kind of flywheel effect that doesn't exist right now in mass participation or in triathlon for that matter.
Thanks, Tim. And I guess, in terms of those fans, the supporters a big role as well. So your age groupers, you've got probably some pure fans that are also participants, but the role of the supporter, how do you see them as in that holistic approach?
Like absolutely crucial, right? Because if you're an age grouper and there are no fans there, or they're not kind of in the right areas, or they're too spread out, or they're not having a good experience, I guess for the age grouper, then the experience goes down a couple of notches. And so again, we have to focus on getting them into the right areas of the race. So there's that kind of amphitheater kind of style kind of points during the races. And, fundamentally make sure they're having fun, make sure they're having a good time. And, I don't really treat the fan as a mass participation fan. Fundamentally, they're a fan, they're a supporter. So we should look at other mainstream sports to see how they're treating the fans on site, what their experience is, and ultimately what the value back to them is, right? Because if it's not going to be a value experience, they probably won't come back. And so it's a big task for us this year to kind of understand what the fan wants, and we're not just putting on a race and hoping that people turn up. It's about kind of a value add back to them, and so that's something that we've really got to work hard on, because we want people to return, and we want people to engage with the PTO and with what we're doing. But ultimately supporting the participant on their journey and also it's not just at the race, right? It's their whole journey from when they sign up to when they get to the racetrack.
Yeah, that's a great, and I think that's one of the big opportunities is that journey. And Stephanie, obviously you've had an experience in your kind of previous life working with WePlay, of working with the likes of Formula One and rugby and Ironman, and now with Meta, with the platforms, the various platforms you have, really an opportunity to facilitate some of that journey. I'd love to get your sense of how would you define a fan in more the mass participation context. And the poll showed that we're predominantly, as expected, 70% 79% people from the mass participation industry here, organizers ranging from Mike Nishi at the top of the pyramid with the Chicago Marathon to other people organizing smaller events. We've got a few people from music and festivals and governments here, but what would your definition be of a fan?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I mean, certainly when I was at WePlay and as you mentioned, I was kind of supporting clients, the likes of Ironman and some UK-based organizations, Threshold Sports, Limelight Sports, Active Sport, and, you know, doing a lot of their kind of media planning, strategy, activation. So a lot of my time was spent thinking about, yeah, who are these fans? How can we identify them? And at what point during that journey do we want to reach them in order to convert them into a participant? But in terms of the definition of a fan, I think, you know, and this is the case for any type of fan, but there's always going to be a spectrum, right? You're going to have your very casual fan at one end of the scale to your super fan at the other. And your casual fan might be your mum, your dad, your grandparent, who, you know, they've never really been immersed in this world, but you're taking part in your first marathon. So they are interested in you and following your journey. But at the end of that journey, they might not, you know, interact with the world again. Through to your super fan, who might be engaging on lots of levels, you know, visiting kind of different websites. They might be following specific athletes. And so basically kind of what happens across that scale, or the way that I think about it, is that the frequency and the volume of those touch points with the industry increase as you get towards that kind of super fan level of the spectrum. So yeah, in a world where we have kind of so many data points, you know, from a digital perspective, it's a little bit easier to be able to kind of pin those together and understand where users sit on that particular spectrum. But I think because the fans haven't been a focus much, you know, in kind of strategies that have, you know, gone until now, then I think, you know, a real focus for organizations needs to be around creating that opportunity to obtain that fan data. So where Tim was speaking there about, you know, the events that they're going to put on and thinking about the fan experience, it's how can they make that fan experience an opportunity for data capture so that they can understand more about who those fans are. And then you can begin to think about, okay, how do we speak to these particular fans and how do we nurture them along that journey to potentially being a participant? But if not, how can we utilize some of that data as a commercial opportunity?
Wonderful, thank you. Unmish, let's come across to you, and you've worn many hats in your career, from, you know, Fox Sports to news to ESPN to working on the digital side with the International Cricket Council. You know, you've been in the mass participation space as much as, you know, 5 years or 6 years attending MPW and interacting with the industry, although not necessarily being, you know, a direct member of the industry. You know, huge breadth and depth of knowledge there. What would your take on it be, please?
I'm going to try and sort of combine what Tim and Stephanie have said, but I'll probably be provocative, as is normal. Let's start, let's frame it in the context of mass participation. So the fan in the context of I think the first definition to my mind is it's an irrational consumer. A consumer is very rational, so 3 strikes and you're out. Whereas to Steph's point, if it's a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt who are turning out, they're there for an emotional reason, more often than not. But they're still a consumer. So they're a potential but irrational consumer. I think if you start framing on that perspective, then you can try and work out, you know, where they sit from a segmentation perspective and passion points and all that kind of stuff. I think the second variable or filter would be they're the member of a community, which again could be concentric circles, depending on whether it is actually, you know, driving a teenager to the physio, or actually driving the husband and the wife to race day, or whatever the case might be. They're part of the community. You know, looking after the kids while the partner's out on a 20K run, as the case might be. They're part of a community and they contribute. You know, it takes a village. I think thirdly, I'd say it's a potential athlete. You know, again, to Stephanie's point, they may not sort of have another outing as anybody between the age of sort of 5 and 75, but you never know. So if you sort of have that broader view as a event promoter or a tour, as what Tim does, and sort of have three different lenses of an irrational consumer, or a potential irrational consumer, or an existing and or latent member of a community, and a potential future athlete. Each of them sort of have very different needs and personas, which you can then begin to talk to.
Tim, you're nodding. What
yeah, no. I was waiting for you there. No, I think just to touch on that, I mean, for us, because we have this pro element, which fundamentally, is core to the business model, right? The age group racing is there to support, the industry and to provide that value throughout the whole chain. But the TV broadcast is the biggest part, right? That's the area that we want to change in the industry, right? It's never been done before. And so we look at participants and fans as a way of really kind of creating that FOMO moment, right? We want those moments within the sport. So again, it's about how do we get people down there? How do we get a crowd to come to our events with really defined experiences? So, one of the things that I think we can do is how do we create that thought leadership, sharing of experience from the pros to the whole industry at our events, and make it super high quality, and give them access to the pros, which they wouldn't ordinarily get anywhere else. And that really is probably more on the participant side, right? Because part of our kind of sell is we're saying, race your race and watch the pros, the next day race for $1 million US dollars. It doesn't happen that often. And so I would say we're kind of redefining what that experience is, rather than having this is the definition of it at the moment. I'm not too worried about that right now. I'm kind of worried about how do we define it, and how do we define it in the right way going forward. But if we can create a TV broadcast that is, broadcast globally, and there's thousands of people in the shot and they're all having an amazing time, like that's absolutely number one for us. So it's kind of that whole week, long weekend, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, if we can create that momentum into the pro weekend, where the age groupers have had a fantastic time, their supporters have, they've had, maybe there's a music festival, some fantastic merchandise on offer. They've met the pros, they've had some thought leadership from the professionals and other people within the endurance space. And then they get to watch, the pros go head to head. That's a fairly unique experience, we think. And if we do that 5 times a year and they become the bucket list, then there's a huge amount of value creation there. So that's what kind of we're kind of focused on at the moment for the PTO Tour.
Stephanie, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I guess we've kind of, speaking quite a lot there about the kind of event day itself, but I guess there's a lot of opportunities to try and create the kind of community aspect that Unmesh was talking about sort of prior to event day. And, on Facebook was founded as a platform for communities, and very much still is, it's still kind of part of our mission. And within that, Facebook groups specifically created for like-minded individuals to find each other and to share in similar interests. And actually, groups are something that have been leveraged by the mass participation world very effectively for years and years, largely.
Chris, if I can just sort of pick up on where Steph was going.
Guidance and
sorry, you froze momentarily, but finish up what you were going to say, and then Unmesh was going to jump in there.
Go ahead, Steph.
Oh, sorry, am I back?
No,
yeah,
you're back. You're back.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was saying about how the mass participation world has very, very effectively utilized kind of groups in order to build communities, most commonly for participants. But actually, more recently, we have increasingly started to see groups being created for the fans and supporters specifically, and specifically around kind of like charitable events. So Cancer Research UK, they have a group called the Super Supporters, and it's grown to around kind of 15,000. And it is a community purely for the supporters of those participating. And I think kind of charity events is another sort of interesting take, because actually quite often it is the supporters who are even more invested in the outcomes of the participants, because they're there because, in this example, cancer has touched their lives in some way, or it's, you know, kind of a close relative or friend or whatever. So yeah, that's just kind of an example of where that's been done sort of super effectively, and something that is pretty kind of lightweight and low resource for organizations to tap into.
Yeah, I mean, Ben Burchuk was sharing on when I hosted the World Athletics one. I mean, the statistics for groups in running were enormous. I think the statistic he gave was that there's more running groups than NBA following groups in the US, which was, you know, I certainly found an interesting statistic. I'd love to come back to that in a little while to understand a little bit about the narrative that takes place within those groups, and how it's, you know, how the industry can help drive that narrative and the kind of content that goes in there to engage those supporters. But let's come to the point that you were going to make there, Unmesh, please.
No, I was picking up on what Steph said. I sort of was trying to break it down. I think location and time. You know, mass participation events have a lead up and have a cadence where a lot of times people are doing routines which are similar, differ in quality, but similar in time and effort and time of day to what their athletes, what their heroes are doing. And, you know, digital can actually leverage that across geography, location, time, all that kind of stuff. It sort of goes back to my sort of point around, you know, treating people as part of a community. And then the second thing, which I think sort of Steph alluded to, is also, it's linked to being considering the fan or the supporter as a consumer, is to reward loyalty. And the loyalty may not necessarily be to you're doing the miles on the road, but it might actually be on other acts that you might be doing, which has got a material or a non-material output. One of the things I was always very, very curious about, and we've definitely seen that in India with the broadcast of cricket in a dozen languages, is commentary, fan commentary. You know, it's such a huge magnet. Every child thinks that, I don't know, they're a John Motson or a Harsha Bhogle or whatever the case might be. And now digital allows you to do that. And if you start doing that, they bring clusters themselves, break down language barriers, break down age barriers, which would be very interesting. So I think this location, role, and time, all three can be sort of synthesized using digital and social.
I love that, and just quickly from there, there's a comment from Sam Middlehurst that I'll come to there. Sam, I've seen that, but I think that whole you know, triathlon, you've done quite a lot to kind of spice up that broadcast and the opportunity to make it more engaging. You know, running, you know, let's be honest, has a challenge to how do you make you know, watching 2 hours of a marathon at the pointy end for some people, but then watching 5-6 hours of other members. You know, I remember when we were doing Singapore, we used to have, you know, the elite, and then we'd switch over to try and get a whole bunch of color. And you know, how many of those 40,000 people can you get featured? And Grandma's sitting on the sofa and she's got little to no chance of seeing Unmesh. So, you know, how do you keep her engaged? Is it that she's sitting there hoping that she's going to get a glimpse of him somewhere, and how do we build that engagement? And I think, again, you know, that comes back to the event day experience, and you know, my sense is that that's probably actually a relatively small part of what the opportunity is. When I had this kind of light bulb moment a few weeks ago, I feel that the real opportunity is in the journey, and we've touched on that a little bit, and that I guess kind of goes to a little bit to Sam's point. He says, when we talk about fans, should we be making a distinction between a fan of the sport and a fan of an individual participant of an event? And you know, that's my kind of thought process, is that I think there's this huge opportunity. In simplistic terms, Unmesh decides to run the Singapore Marathon. He's got his immediate family, he's got his extended family, he's got friends, he's got work colleagues, he's maybe got clients that are going to support him on that journey. But as an industry, what do we do to do that? You know, he signs up, he gets his email saying, congrats, you've signed up. You know, here's a few things that you have to do. But is there an opportunity for us to say, and now you've signed up, here's an opportunity with some kind of tech or platform integration to be sharing with your group, invite them to come and join you here. And that then gives us as an industry the opportunity to have this engaged group of fans, and there I'm referring to the second kind of fan that Sam's talking about, when you're going to partners to say, we got 50,000 runners and we've got 2,000 engaged fans who are sharing that journey. But you know, love to get your thoughts on that, who'd ever like to pick it up.
Tim, you were leaning forward meaningfully, so I should withdraw.
I was more going to talk about the technology within the broadcast first, but I would say it's a missed opportunity right now, right? And that's, I guess, why we're having this discussion, because from our side we have lots of those kind of incentives and those offers for the participants, and I guess we assume, or it's wrong, or we wrongly assume that their family and friends are going to come along, and that's cool. Whereas there should be a lot more on offer. I guess from our perspective, our value add for those supporters is probably on the content side and the storytelling side, right? So really trying to get them into the mindset of it's super interesting to watch the participant, but it is also super interesting to learn about the professionals, the elite level of the sport, which is where we're focused as well. So I guess it's looking at it in a 360 approach. I get the whole, what are the incentives for the fans of the participant? But for us, it's more about creating that 360 experience and ensuring that the professionals come across in a way that they become heroes, right? And that's the way we think we can grow the sport. I would say it hasn't been the focus, right? And that's why there's a gap, right, in the market, and I guess that can be filled by technology would be the first one, and platforms like Meta providing that kind of immersive experience on site and off site, in order that they don't feel forgotten and they don't feel kind of left out. So I guess it's a huge opportunity for the market to find out though, what are those solutions. So
a couple of points. I think if you take football in the UK, yeah. The beauty of the FA Cup is a Premier League side can lose to Colchester Town. That comes under the FA. It's the FA Cup. It does not come under the EPL. So I think there's a distinction to be made between a professional league, which has got a very different criteria, benchmark of success, and hence the coverage of it, which is what you're doing, Tim, as opposed to the federation, which is charged with a very different kind of a mandate. That's my first point. My second point is, I think I still remember, when I used to live in London more than 10 years ago, Nike Run had come out. It was the latter half of the first decade. And all of us used to sort of, run at different times of the day, and we'd have groups and our mileage would get aggregated. A decade later, Formula E allows fan intensity to actually add kilowatt hours to the engine of a car. So if I take one level below, not the pros, but the serious amateurs, why can't I actually have some kind of a time differential, like a handicap, based on some mechanism of gamification of fan passions, family passion, as the case might be? So then what's happening is you're actually connecting the serious runner, who may or may not be a professional runner, but takes it pretty seriously, and their family, who actually adds a lot of value. There's some material gain and impact they can make. But again, as I said, that's outside the focus or priority of the league. But it's probably something that if you bring a Unilever or somebody else bring in with a Meta and a Strava, it could be a very, very strong activation, because it's two different performances happening on the same stage, one on the stage and one sort of just below the stage.
I love the Formula E example there. Yeah, that was I was back at Formula E in 2014, I think it was, and we came up with the fan boost idea. I guess with those, back then it was seen as really gimmicky. It was like, guys, what the hell are you doing? You're messing with the format. And the FIA at that point, the governing body, really had an issue with it. But then they saw the value in it longer term for the fans and the professionals to be connected. Right. And that's really what it drove. It drove a huge amount of engagement and conversation and debate between professional driver and their audience. And so, to Sam Middlehurst's point, the age grouper and the professional, are they different? Are they the same? One of the same thing? How do we engage them on a different level? I would say we're not there yet, right? Because there's a lot of fundamentals of the sport that are not in place right now. The foundational elements are not in place to then put those extra kind of layers of fan engagement on top of. Steph,
back to you.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna jump in, kind of coming back to your previous point around the sort of the fan journey and how can we facilitate that and make it easier. And, it's commonplace that individuals will, be sharing their kind of training on Strava, etc. There's kind of the gamification element that Umesh mentioned. And I know that the Singapore Marathon, they have their virtual club, and, you want to participate in so many events every week, and then you can kind of share that on your socials. But what I'm thinking about is how can organizations kind of tap into that? Because it's all very well these things kind of happening for individual users and their fan bases in isolation, but really, how do the organizations leverage that? And I think kind of a big kind of strategy that's sometimes overlooked is kind of use of influencers, but I don't mean influencers in the sense of kind of super famous athletes. I'm thinking more of kind of identifying or utilizing and championing everyday participants almost as micro influencers, because I think we haven't mentioned it yet, but the ripple effect report that that you guys published, I can't remember the exact stat, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was that every runner influences 200 people on race day. Was it something along those lines? And if kind of in the journey to the event day, what if you can utilize these participants as micro influencers, and you can influence each of their individual fan bases before you even get to the event? And a product that kind of launched on Instagram not so long ago, around 6 months ago, is collabs. And a collab post is essentially a co-curated post between two profiles. So say you were an organization and you had 5 individuals, you wanted to champion them and their journey, you could then co-curate a post that would publish to both of your feeds, but it's still one post. So any engagement on that one post from either the organization's fan base or that individual's fan base gets aggregated. And the organization would then, in a future activation, be able to retarget all of those individuals of the runner's fan base almost as their own. So you can start to see that kind of over time, if you say you had this kind of micro influencer content strategy, and you're tapping into all these individual participants' own fan bases, then you can begin to think about how you can very rapidly expand your own, and then, present that to a commercial partner, for example, as kind of a bigger offering. So, yeah.
It's fascinating exactly what you're saying, because it really is what 10 years ago was the MCN wave on YouTube, which was, a bunch of people sort of doing stuff, out of the closet, as the case might be. But micro-influencers, it could be everything from, makeup to food, whatever the case might be. And these were people who were just doing it from the passion. It was a hobby for them. And then it grew. If you look at food, if you look at music, if you look at gaming, you look at wellness, I think mainstream sports fans haven't been sort of framed in that context. So yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, and I think, when you, sorry, carry on, Steph.
No, I was just going to say, from a marketing standpoint, kind of thinking around the sort of emotional versus rational marketing. And I think, when it's on an individual level and it's individual people's stories, that's what really captures that kind of emotive side. And it's much easier to kind of get across the message that you want to get across, and for people to sort of buy into your story. So I think, I just think that's kind of an interesting strategy that more organizations could consider.
And I think, continuing on that, obviously that family network, Gran's got her own hobbies, that if you understand what they might be, and Mom's got her own hobbies, and those kind of, understanding what that is, that brings potential new partners to the table. At the moment, most partnerships are being marketed on, these are runners, they fit healthy people. The reality is that Gran might not be the fittest, healthiest person, but she might have a passion, and there might be a whole bunch of people in that supporter group that have their passion, that bring value to a particular partner that might be able to be brought to the table. We touched on technology a little bit there. Any sense of, Tim, you doing a lot with putting technology into the broadcast, but in a broader sense, what kind of technology have we seen out there that can help enhance this journey? So from registration to event day, or call it event day rather than
for the participant. For the participant or for the
for the participant and the fan. So, you know, if I'm a supporter, you know, what are ways that technology can help build engagement in that journey as we go away? So, you know, the participants, the age groupers, the serious ones are, you know, they're using their Strava and various other, they might be, you know, training on Peloton or, you know, whatever those, you know, the various sport specific ones are. But, you know, what is there around tech that might be able to bring others in?
Yeah, I think it feels quite fragmented at the moment, the space does. And so it's certainly something we're looking at to try and unify that experience. So if we're to launch a PTO direct to consumer application, you know, the questions we now have are, is that one for a broadcast consumer? Is that one for a participant and an age grouper? Is that one for their fans and their supporters? There is nothing really that has unified the space, right? And so again, that's a massive gap in this market that we will look to address for sure. And then I think on a basic level, you know, the fan at the event, they want to know where their participant is, right, at certain points in the journey, in their race. And so there needs to be a base level, a foundational level of data available at the race, and easily available, easily accessible. But then how do we, I think to Stephanie's point, how do we then take advantage of that consumer who's on site, who's engaged, and then get them to engage in something different? And that could be the live race the next day. It could be some content on socials. It could be, log into the app again. Is it incentive-based, loyalty-based? You know, so there is a space for that unified experience that certainly, I certainly haven't seen it. And, you know, we could look to solve that problem, right? It's certainly there. And, you know, you could then commercialize it a lot easier than you can right now. And that goes to the whole point within the triathlon world. It's so fragmented right now, and it is hard to commercialize. So I think anything that can centralize the experience and make it more frictionless than it currently is, I would say is a good thing.
You know, it's fascinating what you're saying, Tim. I'm going to make a comment and then give a suggestion. My bet is that the most of the solutions are going to come from people who are not runners, who are not in mass participation, but they're in trade conventions, or, you know, they're in large sort of, you know, something who's working in the Dubai Expo, for example, something of that sort. And that's kind of where it's going to come from. Because, you know, they come at this more from a perspective of how do you manage a mass of people in a space which is like an amoeba, and it keeps moving, but they have got a certain central reference point, which is the athlete that they've got. So that was my comment. The suggestion is you should probably meet, and I'm happy to introduce you to Michael Cole. Michael Cole is the CTO of the European Tour, who to my mind is amongst the most sensitive and articulate CTO in sport today. And I include the American leagues as well, where, you know, the guys, the NBA, are doing some phenomenal work, because he gets it. He gets consumers, he gets the players, gets events, all the stakeholders. We were talking about a couple of years ago, and he had mentioned about how the Ryder Cup, which is a match play format, it's not a stroke play format, and you want to know which team you want to support and be on which fairway, cut across which green, you know, that kind of stuff. It's a very fluid place. And they'd use RFID, which is radio frequency ID. I think this was the Ryder Cup before the last one in Europe, so not the one in Italy. It's probably about 4 years ago now. And how they had used that to actually A, manage crowd control, B, provide location-based, hole-based notifications to users to go where they want to go. So I'm taking a parallel between a golf course, 18 holes, 25 acres of land, similar to a marathon, which is potentially a bit larger, but about the same. And you're interested in watching a particular athlete or a particular group of athletes. It can be fascinating what they did. And of course, they got a sponsor for it as well, which is always an icing on the cake.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, there's lots of parallels between golf, and in particular the Ryder Cup. You know, the Collins Cup is based on that format. And again, you know, if fans and supporters don't have access to data, the whole thing falls down, right? There is no narrative, there's no storytelling. And that can often be difficult over large areas, right? So yeah, that would be great for sure to, you know, we're very keen to learn off other sports, you know, and, you know, tennis and golf are certainly two areas where I think triathlon can learn a huge amount from. and things like Formula E, you know, on the fan engagement side. You know, there's no reason why those type of initiatives can't come into mass participation. And so, yeah, we're very open, right? And I think that's what the industry needs. It needs new ideas and a fresh look at things.
And I think picking up on that a little bit, that, you know, focusing on that event day experience, the kind of pinnacles are, you know, your World Marathon Majors, your Ironman, your big style of events where, you know, there's lots of stuff happening. Many of these are kind of cash strap, kind of hand to mouth type of organizations, and, you know, the participants have a great running experience. The fans, you know, drop someone off, they hang around, you know. Sometimes it's a beautiful day and it's fine to go and sit in a cafe. Other times it's cold and wet and windy or baking hot if you're somewhere in like Singapore, and it's kind of a chore. And I'm wondering that, you know, the role of technology in creating opportunities around, you know, organizers will say, well, it's going to cost me a fortune to set up a village. I don't have the budget. I don't have the partners to do that. But what can technology help to do to say, well, these are the 5 points you can watch them, and you know, these are the best cafes, and here's a shoe store where you might be able to go and look around, and here's some other areas of interest that become part of that journey. So from that engagement, it's like, you know, Umesh, you've signed up. Here's how your fans can engage with you on the way, and this is how your fans can engage on the day. And, you know, more and more events are getting the live tracking app, but often that's kind of watching a dot on a screen, or it's just watching, you know, checkpoints come up to indicate where you are, where you can meet. So that's made it a lot better than it might have been years ago, where you didn't even know where they were, and you kind of stood around for 4 hours and then discovered you'd missed them by 2 minutes because you went to the toilet as they crossed the finish line, type of thing. So there's more of that, but kind of a sense of, you know, anything that you've seen that can enhance that experience. The Ryder Cup one seems to be a good example of that, Unmesh, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and I think it's, you know, as Tim was saying, the beauty of something like the PTO is you got no legacy, and therefore, and yet in many ways you have very little expectations from the fan and or the sponsors, which is, I think, what Formula E also benefited from. Because the codes aren't that dissimilar. It's still a car, except that it's an EV as opposed to a sort of fossil, or like a petrol car or something. But that's interesting. I had a question for Stephanie, if that's all right. I wanted to get, you know, you talked about data and segmentation and retargeting. You also talked about Strava. I've always been curious, as a race organizer, if I'm using Strava, some kind of a gamification play for my participant, fan, amateur athletes, what could Meta or Facebook specifically provide at a triangulation perspective? So if I've got a user who's using a third-party app, but that is being posted on one of Meta's apps, what value could you derive for someone like Tim, for example? Sorry, Chris, it's a very rare opportunity to get a chance to ask that question.
No, it's great.
Yeah, no, I think I understand the question. So if for example, a user would share an activity captured on Strava to a social network, how can you kind of like then harness
how
that
can
data?
PTO's page or relationship with Meta help Tim to talk to his sponsors or race organizers, as the case might be?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there's kind of a disconnect, right, from an individual kind of posting it to their own network, and then an organization being able to tap into that. So that was where I kind of suggested collabs as being an opportunity. If you can kind of that can provide that link, so the organization can actually tap into that kind of incremental fan base. Yeah, I think from that kind of example that you gave from that third party app perspective, it's a little bit more difficult. I would say in terms of, you know, kind of reaching new audiences and users and being able to kind of draw them into your audience base, really the most effective way of doing it is kind of through content discovery on our platforms. So there are sort of specific formats that have been designed to reach new users who don't already follow you and aren't already within your ecosystem, and those two notably being Reels and Facebook Watch. So Reels obviously kind of taking off in a big way on Instagram, and also more recently launched on Facebook. And a very, very high proportion of the distribution of Reels will be to unconnected users. So we kind of spend a lot of time speaking to our clients and partners around how can you create content that's not actually necessarily designed for your fan base? How can you kind of pull in other interest topics that are going to actually entertain and draw in individuals who aren't already in that world? And then once someone has engaged with a video asset specifically of yours, that is when you can begin to kind of build an audience pool and then retarget them, or, from kind of a partner's perspective, say that video was a piece of branded content. So it's where your kind of commercial partner has been tagged in a video. You could then essentially kind of build an audience off of all of those pieces of content that has had your partner tagged in it, and package it up and say, hey, there's this audience that we have, built off the back of this video content. We know these users have watched this piece of content, so they're already aware of you. They're a very kind of hot audience because they've engaged with it recently. And then you can kind of use that as a point of negotiation, and then effectively and allow them to kind of retarget against that group. So yeah, sorry, that kind of didn't quite give you the answer that you wanted to your initial question.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating in terms of, it's great to sort of get the perspective of how you think about it as an enabler for an event promoter. So no, thank you for that, Stephanie.
Thanks, Steph. I'm interested in terms of this kind of cross-section of the audience. You've spoken about groups, you've spoken about Reels, and what kind of, is it really the bigger organizations that have the resources and the strategy to get involved, or are you starting to see a genesis of more of the smaller groups? So you spoke about the Cancer Supporters Group with 15,000 members, charity based with volunteers driving it. The people that are starting to utilize it that are utilizing it from a commercial perspective, wanting to sort of segue a little bit into how do we commercialize this. Are there any case studies of examples of someone where you can say, okay, and not necessarily having to name a brand or an event, but an example that this is what was done and these were some of the commercial outcomes that were created as a result of engaging those fans?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've kind of seen in the athlete space, actually, particularly in the run up to the Winter Olympics. So there was a snowboarder called Scotty James. He didn't have a particularly big following, but he published a few reels and they kind of, went quote unquote viral. He suddenly got so many millions of views, and it was something beyond kind of any level of engagement that he'd got before, because he got that really high unconnected distribution. Didn't necessarily matter that his own fan base wasn't that big, because it was reaching a lot of other audiences. And then, I haven't been as close to kind of his journey since then, but I mean, theoretically, then he's suddenly got this kind of pool of people that would enable him, even as someone who's just becoming to the point of being well known and not already being a big brand, that he could go to a potential sponsor and use that as kind of an attractive proposition that they could potentially tap into. So yeah, it definitely doesn't need to be kind of these big organizations that have big followings. It's definitely, if you kind of use the platform and the formats in the right way, then there's certainly kind of a lot of opportunity to expand that, pretty rapidly. Just in terms of kind of the other commercialization opportunities on platform, and talking about why you might want to engage fans who might never convert. Like, why do you want to kind of invest resource and keeping them within your because you can actually directly monetize that audience on platform through your content. So in-stream ads is a product that we have on Facebook, and say you've been able to kind of grow your audience to a certain level, the content that you're publishing, that particular audience are watching, and then advertisers would pay to have an ad appear within your piece of content. So essentially, kind of the more diverse and the broader that your audience that you have that you can bring to the table, the more likely it is that you're going to have advertisers who want to reach certain individuals within that audience. And then, once an advertiser pays for that ad impression, then you as the organization get a rev share off the back of that. So that's the kind of the broader audience monetization opportunity on platform.
That's a really interesting one for me. And my sense is that might sound kind of a little bit counterintuitive to some of the people that are watching, and again, it highlights to me, I think, the opportunity. So the focus on we're runners, we're triathletes, but as we bring in this broader fan base, you're addressing that need for a broader audience that becomes more appealing to advertisers. That's an interesting one. Yeah, thank you. We've got less than 10 minutes to go, and I just wanted to grab a couple of the comments here in the chat. So Anthony Bliss, as a participant in events, I do most of my fan engagement, friends and family, after the event, because only one or two might be at the event, but most of them I speak to engage with on a social media afterwards with my race photos, selfies, and with my medal, usually within 48 hours. When most people ask, how was your weekend? Most of them will have no idea I was going to the event. After the event is the first time there is a personal fan engagement. I think you need to define between professional event fan and showbiz typing it versus your 2,000 person half marathon. But again, that seems to reiterate for me, thank you for that, Anthony, that that engagement is coming close to the event, after the event, and it seems to suggest that how can an event equip you, Anthony, with the tools to be able to go to that fan base of yours, to bring them on that journey from as soon as you register and start training, to support you and go through there. Thanks for that. Sam Middlehurst, Unwish's point, spatial intelligence tech can solve this problem, and he's put a link in there, mesh.com. Richard Burnett, live photos, little plug for you there, Richard. Richard does live photos at events, and it has made some amazing advances in terms of instant photo uploaded rather than waiting for 24 hours around that. And then Sam again, the challenge for MPE around tech adoption is so often a lack of funds and invest in tech and marketing due to the broken business model. Could PTO's disruptive and unique commercial model give them a chance to overcome this challenge and trailblaze for the industry?
There you go, Tim. No pressure.
No, I like this. Sam, Sam's a big friend of the PTO and knows a huge amount about the industry. And one of the things on technology is really interesting. We have so much technology on site there, right, for the professional race. So from a broadcast standpoint, so how do we use that tech infrastructure for the age groupers, right? So other than just a live race photo or a finisher pick at the end of their race, can we create an engaging reel for each participant that's delivered directly to their device, 5 minutes after their race, through AI or machine learning or some other methods, purely because, like Sam says, we have that infrastructure. We've been able to invest in the right areas due to our investment profile. So that does give us, I would say, unique opportunity to treat the age grouper like a professional, right? That's fundamentally the experience we want to end up with. It will take us a bit of time to get there. But to Stephanie's point, can we deliver right to their device content that they want to share with their community, that then creates the flywheel effect, and hopefully creates more fans and more participants. One of the things we're doing is having not just an age group triathlon event, but we're having swim, bike, and run individual events at our events this year, which means that our audience base is all of a sudden much, much bigger than just people who want to do triathlon. And that's our way of kind of putting our arms around the industry and saying, it's not just about people who want to do triathlon. If you're just a runner, you can come and do a 5K run. If you want to do an open water swim. And so that allows that addressable audience to be, so much bigger. Thanks,
Tim. Folks, we've got 3 minutes. I'm going to throw it back to each of you for a minute. Your kind of key takeaway, any insight that you'd like to share as a final wrap. I usually do a wrap, but I'm going to put the pressure on each of you tonight to do that for me in terms of what your key takeaway is from either, one standout that you've heard or one other thing that you'd like to share that you think might be of value.
Yeah, for me, just quickly to wrap up, I think it's about having that centralized kind of technology experience from start to finish, from, you know, when you register to post event, and to have a frictionless experience for the age group and, you know, and their support network, which also can then translate into them becoming fans of the professional, you know, of the elites of the sport. And I think in turn that will help with the overall growth and commercialization of the sport.
Thanks, Tim. Stephanie?
Yeah, mine's more around data. I think we didn't really get into the weeds of this too much, but around organizations kind of making a conscious effort to create opportunities for fan data capture specifically, whether that's kind of at the event, you know, you might have a kind of a fan experience that someone signs up for, or even something simple like offering Wi-Fi in return for, you know, an email address and a name. You know, on the event day, but then also kind of in the run up, how can you kind of capture and bring new fans into your fan base through content discovery, etc., so that you can begin to understand who those people are and put them in different kind of cohorts.
Wonderful, great one, thank you. And Unmish?
I'm going to go with, I think the best is yet to come as far as mass participation at an amateur, community, competitive, or professional level. I think the beauty of what PTO is doing in all such initiatives is that the technologies of this decade, you know, mixed reality, computer vision, machine learning, all of them can actually, they fundamentally are very good at creating order to a disparate situation, which is not stadium-based sport fundamentally. So I'm really bullish in terms of there's an openness of mind of the promoters. There's a larger sort of, you know, sport for good impact, and the technology exists for this decade compared to you know, sort of grid computing and video encoding. It's more sort of, you know, cloud and computer vision and machine learning, which actually will be the paint that these promoters are going to be able to use to on the canvas.
Wonderful, thank you. Folks, we're spot on. I think we're exactly on the hour for mine. So yeah, wonderful conversation. We could have gone for 2 hours, I'm certain. Thanks for all of the insights. Thanks for those of you that have joined us. A big thank you, Stephanie, joining us from London. Tim also from London. Unmish in Singapore. The sun's about to go down there. Unmish, it's got to get dark there. That beautiful view over the cricket ground that I missed, but wonderful to see you all, and thank you so much. And just a quick reminder, the next MPW Global updates will be on the 10th of May, and our next webinar on the 26th of May, and really look forward to seeing many of you back then. But for the time being, have a wonderful day, night, evening, wherever you might be. Thanks so much for your time, panelists, and all the best.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.